Hello, I'm Dr. Nick Gordon. From the 17th century, young men of quality began travelling from England to the continent in increasing numbers, drawn by antiquities, an interest in connoisseurship and collecting, and of course, by the looser moral expectations of Italy and Greece. These travellers on the so-called Grand Tour were always on the lookout for souvenirs that they could take home, and the city of Venice was expert at providing these. In this episode, Dr. Kathleen Olive introduces us to the pioneering techniques of Rosalba Carriera, a Venetian artist who perfected the pastel medium and whose work embodies the values and aesthetics of the Grand Tour in the Rococo age. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you, Nick.
So today you're going to be talking to us about the work of Rosalba Carriera. Just to start, could you let us know why you've selected this particular portrait of hers?
Rosalba Carriera is a Venetian artist who is interesting both because of the way she really supplies a commercial demand in the city of Venice in the Rococo period, but also because of the way in which she develops an emerging medium for artistic representation, and that's the pastel medium. And of course, I think she's also interesting because she is a very successful woman artist in an age when in Western Europe there really aren't very many women working at her level of skill, but also commercial and professional success. And I think she's also interesting because of the way in which she frequently turned to herself in very interesting self-portraits that capture her over quite a long period in her life. So that's why I've chosen this self-portrait of hers for us to talk about today.
So before we talk more about the portrait itself, how did she become an artist, such a successful artist in an age that was dominated by men?
We don't know a huge amount about how she became an artist. Her father was a lawyer, so not really a profession that you would expect to produce an artist. But her mother was certainly known for her designs with textiles, particularly for embroidery and lace making, which was a Venetian skill, which was produced by women artists in Venice, but which was characterised more by the type of word craft. So it wouldn't have been considered an art form in its own time, it would have been considered a craft form, and therefore women were engaging in that kind of work when they weren't really permitted to be engaging as artists with a capital A. And Rosalba Carriera's sister marries a well-known painter of the 18th century in Venice. So she does have a connection to the artistic world in that sense. But she seems to be largely self-taught. She does get some mentoring from other male artists working in particular in miniatures in Italy, because that's the medium from which she emerges. She begins as a miniaturist. This was an art form that, because of its size and its delicacy and its refinement, was considered particularly suitable for women and our innate qualities of smallness and elegance and refinement, apparently. So she emerges as a miniaturist, and then she progresses to really specialising in the medium of pastel. And that's what we're looking at today. We're looking at a pastel self-portrait.
Could you, for those who are listening, could you describe the self-portrait for us, please?
Certainly. So this one's in the Gemälde Gallery in Dresden. It was produced towards the end of her life, relatively speaking. Rosalba Carriera is born in 1673 and she dies in 1757. And this self-portrait, we think, comes from the early 1730s. So in the last time of her, last 20 years or so of her life. It's not particularly big. It's about 46 centimetres by 34 centimetres. We can talk about this in more detail, but pastel works weren't terribly large. They did tend to be about the size of an equivalent A4 piece of paper today. So it's not particularly large. It's in very muted tones, as pastel often was. We've got here a real predominance of black, white, grey, and then a very, very rich blue, with just a few highlights in silvery gold tones on jewellery and on decorations on a headpiece. And what we see here is a woman in a later stage of her life. She's half turned towards us, but her head looks directly at us and makes very solemn, concerted eye contact with us. She does not look remotely concerned about her circumstances. There's a real air of self-possession here as she looks at us with a relaxed but closed mouth, and she is wearing very beautiful, luxurious clothing. So she has a very heavy kind of velvet, deep blue coat that is edged with fur and a kind of a brocade decoration. She has a similar hat, which frames her face beautifully, and she has very small but refined and expensive decoration. So she has beautiful pearl earrings and a gold tassel hanging from her hat.
And it's that gaze of hers as she stares directly out towards us with such, as you say, self-possession and confidence, that it's sort of the self-portrait of an artist who is at the absolute top of her game. So we mentioned that kind of this work is done in pastel, and that's partly why it's so small. So how exactly, or what are the pastels that she's using, and how does she create a work that looks like it has all the subtlety of an oil painting?
Yeah, that's a great question. This was an emerging medium in the 17th and 18th centuries. It had been used for a much longer period than that. Leonardo da Vinci does a lot of work in pastel as preparatory work, essentially. But as a finished medium, it didn't really gain value and prestige until this period. And perhaps that's something to do with the medium itself. Pastels, I'm sure people can visualize the kind of chalks that children are given to play with, for example. And pastel is sticks of colour, of quite concentrated pigment that has been mixed with something like a kaolin or a calcium carbonate to give it a kind of a heft and a manoeuvrability. And it is a medium that had been, as Leonardo da Vinci used it, or as really accomplished Italian artists like the Carracci family, or Federico Barocci is a wonderful artist who works in pastel. They're mostly working in it quite quickly to get a rough, we might almost say kind of hazy effect of the work that they're moving towards. But in the 18th century, particularly with people like Rosalba Carriera, but probably people listening are equally familiar with the French artist Watteau, who's better known for working in pastel, but who is actually greatly influenced by Rosalba Carriera, who we're looking at here. They begin using pastels as the finished product, mostly because of the extraordinary potential that it gives them. As you say, what we're looking at here could be a beautifully blended oil painting. But the difference in pastel is that it's a medium that you can use very quickly, and it gives you the potential to work fast.
So with that swiftness of use, how is she then what sort of techniques is she using to get, on the one hand, parts of it that look so spontaneous, but other parts that look so extraordinarily detailed, like the details of her eyes or the trim, or how well blended her complexion is across her skin?
So this is something that Carriera really excels at, and it is not just using a hard corner of pastel in order to get an outline, which is how artists who adopted pastels as a kind of a preparatory medium were using it. Carriera instead varies how she holds the actual stick of pastel, and she also varies how she works it and in what ways she works it. So I might take you through the stages of creating a quite small self-portrait such as the one we're looking at. That swiftness of use with pastel meant that it was particularly suited to portraits on a small scale, and we can talk about who the market is for that in due course. But artists like Carriera working in pastel, they tended to use blue paper. Blue paper, obviously the finished product, then the blue paper gave something as well. It added something in terms of the chromatic range. But mostly pastel artists start with a sheet of blue paper because it tended to be rougher in fibre. And when working in pastel, you do need the paper to grab on, the pastel to grab onto the paper. The paper needs to have some kind of toothiness to it. And they would actually stretch the paper itself over a canvas so that it was quite tensile and it had resistance when they were working quickly with their sticks of pastel. They would start, we know that Carriera does start. You can see this if you were to go online and look at the high resolution image we provide. You'll see that if you really draw into areas like the curve of her neck in this self-portrait, she has started with rough outlines in a brown or a black charcoal or pastel stick in order to block out the figure that she's going to represent. But then she would have covered large areas of the paper with quite broad powdery elements of the pastel. So she would rub it on its side, for example. And she might do a little bit of blending of those areas from the beginning with a finger, but where she really blended was, as you say, in the flesh tones. Sometimes in order to cover large areas of the piece of paper, the background, for example, you would actually mix the pastel, crumbled bits of pastel with a little bit of water, almost like a watercolour, and you could paint that on with a wet brush to cover larger areas of the paper. But really the way in which Carriera excels is in how she blended with her pastels. So if you look at an area like when we look at this self-portrait, if you look to the right of Carriera's left ear, so over to the right side of her hat where the gold tassel decoration is, you can see that from the dark fur hat behind her ear, moving over to our right side of this piece of paper, we move through black to blue to grey to a darker concentration of black again. And to achieve that effect, she's actually laid out parallel bands of colour using the side of the pastel, and then using her fingers or sometimes a little stick covered in a cloth, she's actually blended those areas together, much like you might blend your eyeshadow, for example. And this is called stumping. It's something that she does to great effect. So that smooth transition, which you commented almost looks like an oil, the effect that you might get with glazing and oil painting, here she's achieved it just by moving her finger across those bands of colour very, very subtly to effect. And then the other thing that Carriera does in addition to stumping that she does with such control, and you've commented on this as well, is the way in which she uses the hard edge of the pastel stick, sometimes just damped a little bit to give it a more concentration of colour. She draws with those sharp, hard edges, details like the eyes, for example, or little flecks of light on those pearl earrings that she's wearing, the detail of the gold tassel, you can see that's quite crisp and hard. And so she's finally come back and added in those kind of details with the harder corners of the pastel in order to give the crispness in the midst of this otherwise very loose, fluid, blended, elegant effect. So the alternation between different types of visual textures is really, really finely controlled, but all of that is being done with the exact same stick of colour.
Which is absolutely extraordinary. So just thinking of it's mostly portraiture that she's working in. Whose portraits was she painting with pastel?
Well, the fact that she could do these quickly and that she could do them on a reasonably small scale, and it has to be a reasonably small scale. You might have heard in that description of pastel that it's actually quite a fragile medium. It's very powdery. It doesn't react over time in the way an oil painting might, so it was thought to be actually a really stable medium at the time. But for preservation, it's actually quite fragile. So smaller sizes are better because you've got less risk that your powder is going to come loose in transport. And the people who wanted small-scale portraits like this were tourists. They were predominantly English lords visiting the continent on the grand tour. They loved to come to Venice, not because of its antiquity, not because of its fine collections of art, but because it was a place where they could enjoy the longest carnival period in Europe and break the rules and misbehave and have a great time at masked carnival balls for as long as possible. And while they were there, these grand tourists liked to spend their money on souvenirs. You know, obviously today when we go to Venice, we think about something like glass, but these young men like to have their portraits taken as well, or like to buy small-scale symbolic portraits of personifications of truth and beauty and philosophy, beautiful young women with daringly low-cut gowns that they could then take back to England quite easily because they were small scale. So today, if you were working in pastel, you might actually use a setting agent to fix the work. When you finished it, you could visualize that almost as like a little layer of hairspray right at the end to set your hairstyle. But these pastel artists didn't fix their works because they didn't want to change the color effects they'd achieved in pastel. So these young men commissioning portraits from people like Rosalba Carriera, they're taking home quite small and delicate, more or less A4 size portraits, which therefore you find throughout the world in collections in various places. As I said, this one is in Dresden, but you'll find large collections in the Queen's collection in England, and also in great American collections like the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So small works like this, they travelled really widely. And these young men, these connoisseurs, they weren't just collecting self-portraits. Because Carriera was a woman working in a field in which women didn't tend to reach such professional and commercial success, her self-portraits were highly sought after. It was like having the signature of the artist herself if you had one of her self-portraits, and that's why she chronicles herself over so many ages and stages of her career.
And it's so rare to see a woman's face aging across her entire life in kind of Western art. It's something we just tend not to see. It's always the young, beautiful woman who is a metaphor rather than the woman who is the creator in this case.
Yeah, so we might be quite used to thinking about Rembrandt's face aging over time or Dürer's face aging over time. There are these great Western European series of self-portraits of the artists, but as you say, it's quite rare to get that sense of a woman artist aging over time. And she is symbolic. I mean, that's the beauty of being a woman artist. When you do a self-portrait, you are a symbol. You're a symbol of art with a capital A, which was personified as a woman, but you're also clearly identifiably your physiological self. So you get to play that twin game of being a symbol, but also being a woman aging over time with all of your maturity and experience. And I think that's what I really value in the self-possession of Carriera at this stage in her life. She tended to characterize her self-portraits according to the season. So the summer portraits of Rosalba Carriera when she would be in, say, her 30s and 40s, in her full height as a grown woman. These portraits from the later stage of her life she characterizes as autumn or winter. So she's really seeing her life as a progression through time and through the symbolism of the seasons. But they're quite poignant in some ways, because Rosalba Carriera, as she aged, had quite a difficult experience. She had great problems with her sight over time. She seems to have suffered from cataracts. She had varying operations on her eyes in the 18th century, which is really terrifying to consider as a prospect. Some of them seemed to give her limited positive results over time. Others, towards the end of her life, really badly damaged her sight, and she was unable to work as she aged. And she really suffered mental illnesses as a result of those physical illnesses that are quite poignant, I think, when we look at those later portraits of her, to realise that she was actually a woman going through mental and physical anguish. And yet when you look at a portrait such as this one, it really captures the aesthetic of the Rococo, the elegance and the refinement of the Rococo period. It really captures her as a woman, almost as a photograph might today. But there are these deeper levels once we understand a little bit about her biography.
Well, thank you very much, Kathleen, for revealing kind of this portrait to us today. And it is, as you say, it's such a wonderful way that she has of capturing something of herself, but of herself as art personified. It's a genuinely beautiful and very rare portrait for us to be able to talk about it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick.
You've been listening to Limelight Arts Travels podcast, A Closer Look. It was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past and present.